I'd like to give you some information that I have regarding Native Americans and Alaska Natives. This is another group that I think is underrepresented in many diversity texts that I have run across in the course of teaching such courses, and I thought that the information that I have from other sources as well as from the readings in your own lessons might be of some use here. As we know, Native Americans have lost their land, resources, lives, and culture as a result of the European expansion across our continent and into Alaska since the 1600s. The Indian Wars in the lower 48 states ended in the late 1800s, but even since that time, the federal government's policies have ranged from neglect to coerced acculturation. And as many Native Americans will tell you, the federal government has never honored one treaty it's entered into with Native American tribes. From very early in the settlement of white persons on the continents, Native Americans were seen as a military threat. This approach of conquest over the Native Americans and the devaluation of their values have led to attitudes of colonization and genocide, and the effects of these are still felt today. There has been this belief throughout this process that Native Americans need to be civilized, stemming from the stereotypes of their savage nature with their pagan religion practices that were created by the whites, and this was used primarily to rationalize the policies of termination and extermination that were implemented against the Native Americans during the course of government expansion. Discrimination occurred in interactions with Native Americans throughout the European settlement days and continues to this day. Government agencies and Congress have perpetuated racism and has gone so far as to abolish tribes at different times in our history. Early attempts to civilize the Native American population pursued a goal of kill the Indian and save the man. In the course of education and their assimilation, Native Americans have been separated from their families, and other such atrocities as being punished for speaking their own language, having their hair cut against their will, their children being forbidden to practice many of their religious or cultural traditions, being exposed to deadly diseases, have marked their history. Generations of Native Americans have experienced this trauma and has left the population in general in a state of unresolved grief. On the continent, white settlement expansion in the areas east of the Mississippi in the early 19th century led to the federal government enforcing a policy of Indian removal, pressuring, or really more appropriately, requiring the tribes east of the Appalachians to move west. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 during the Andrew Jackson administration mandated the removal of recalcitrant tribes to move to Indian territory in what is now known as Oklahoma. The Cherokee removal became known as the Trail of Tears because of the fact that thousands of those individuals died from cold weather and disease during the process of resettlement. The Creek Indian tribes of the southeast United States also suffered decimation during this resettlement, and as the nation continued to expand further west, tribes were forced to live on reservations in areas that were really very undesirable and unwanted as far as agricultural purposes were concerned. By the end of the 19th century, assimilation became the focus of the government, and the Native American population itself began to near extinction. Boarding schools, the devastation of culture, the loss of language, the removal of children from Indian homes were a part of the civilization process. Harold Napoleon's work addresses the impact of contact with the West, leading to the Great Death, which resulted in the decimation of Alaska Natives from disease following contact with white persons, and the psychological trauma and loss of culture that endured as leaders of the communities died off and their traditional healers were unable to resolve the problems. In 1971, the Nixon administration established the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which was touted at the time as the model for the appropriation of Aboriginal lands by a federal government. Many Native Alaskans feared that it would result in a cultural genocide of Alaska tribes over time. The Native Claims Settlement Act established the 13 regional corporations which exist today. Alaska tribes continued to negotiate with state and federal government for sovereignty in their lives, and this is a persistent issue in the negotiation of those Alaska Native tribes with the state government. Recently, the federal government implemented some changes, and the state has worked towards many of the Alaska tribes establishing their own child welfare administration programs. Here's a map of what are thought to be the 5 general tribal groups in Alaska. These tribal groups are not so much a source of identification for Alaska Natives, but is more represents cultural and linguistic similarities among the various groups within these regional areas. Different maps and different conceptualization of these tribal groups separate these 5 groups into 7 or 8 different groups as well, but this is generally what is considered to be the 5 tribal groups. In the United States, as far as tribes are concerned, Indian tribes, the federal government recognizes 573 Native American tribes, and of those, 231 of them are in Alaska. The tribal groups themselves each have very different practices and lifestyles across the state, and understanding these differences is something that's very useful to the social worker when working with Alaska Native individuals. Native Americans, and specifically Native Alaskans, have a disproportionate number of social and health problems. For one thing, being overrepresented in the child welfare system. The state of Alaska has been studying for decades now the problem of disproportionality that results in an unusually high percentage of Alaska Native children being placed in foster care. Native Americans and Alaska Natives have higher rates of health problems. Native Americans tend to suffer more extreme poverty than most groups in the United States, experience problems with drug and alcohol abuse and violence and suicide, unemployment, child abuse, elder abuse, are more likely to be victims of violent crimes than members of any other racial group, more than twice the national average. 31% of Native Americans die before their 45th birthday, and Native Americans die from alcoholism and suffer from suicide at rates about 5 times the national rate. Pretty bleak statistics. This slide tells you that in 2017, 22% of Alaska's children were Alaska Native or American Indian, and yet over 57% of Alaska's children in foster care were from those groups. This is the disproportionality issue that we spoke of a moment or two ago. And the health problems that I identified in an earlier slide also exist among Alaska Natives as well. Diseases of the heart, malignant cancers, unintentional injuries, and diabetes are leading causes of death among those groups. American Indians and Alaska Natives today are born with a life expectancy that is 5.5 years less than the general population in the United States. And they continue to suffer from these illnesses and injuries that are identified here on this slide. As limited as the social work intervention is with this group, one problem is that intervention rarely acknowledges the strengths of the population, but really focuses more upon the social problems that are associated with Native Americans. Native Americans are indeed one of the most oppressed groups in the United States, and when addressing these problems, focus is often placed upon individual pathologies rather than the institutional barriers and the racism that contributes to these problems, the discriminatory practices that are ingrained in our society and that remain largely invisible because they are so ingrained in our society, and the invisibility of this racism and discrimination that has led to the profession of social work in general pursuing individual strategies that focus on the individual rather than looking at institutional change. Social work literature often views Native Americans as a social problem group and fails to recognize the strengths and the unique contributions of American Indian tribal and shamanic-based traditions of help and healing. When working with persons from a Native American culture, certain factors that Voss believes are important is, for one, for the worker to listen and not interrupt, to recognize that the family is the center of the client's social structure. The idea of personal space and the formation of circle can be very significant in the course of treatment. Privacy is highly valued in this culture, and spiritual traditions of Native Americans run especially deep. Family ties are very important in Native American culture, as just mentioned, and are interwoven with their religious beliefs and their ideas about the world. Voss says, everything is intimately connected and related to everything else, biologically, spiritually, and physically. Spirituality is something that's particularly important for the worker to recognize in working with Native American and Alaska Natives. Basic elements of this include religion not being able to be conceived as being separable from any other aspect of Native American culture. Language must be understood to have special elements. Words are seen as sacred and should be used with care and responsibility. Native Americans' experience of time and process is different from the linear system that those of us raised in Western cultures recognize. Native cultures see the circle, both cyclical and reciprocal, as the key to understanding in this particular area. And a very important characteristic of Native peoples is the quality and intensity of interrelationships between people and the forces in their natural environment. Some of the current issues that Native American and Alaska Natives face today include issues regarding urbanization and intermarriage, which leads to a decreased identification with the tribes of origin. This eventually could result in the distinctiveness of the American Indian being lessened, both in terms of culture and genetics. Another issue, as mentioned a short time ago, is that Native American sovereignty and political participation in the larger American society. American Indian tribes are the only specific group in American society with separate legal status, but in Alaska, as I've mentioned already, there's a struggle of those tribes to be recognized as sovereign with other governments. Tribal economic development is also an issue, is seen as separate from the individual economic well-being of tribal members. Education of American Indians, as this culture moves away from having their young educated in boarding schools that were intended to civilize or educate Native peoples. More recent educational objectives in Indian educational institutions are more focused upon incorporating aspects of American Indian history and culture and not just the usual role of Indians being engaged with the larger culture in war and battles. There's more interest in American Indian views and philosophies, not just how Native people interact with white people. And some Native American institutions of higher education now exist at different places around the nation. These are more prominent and widespread in Canada, but a number of Native American colleges now exist in the United States as well, including a college that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce in Yukavik, which we used to know as Barrow. Forgive my clumsiness. The repatriation of Native American cultural artifacts and human remains from museums also is a current issue as well. At one point in the 1800s, experts believed that Caucasians had larger brain capacities and thus higher intelligence than American Indians, based upon what was supposed to be a scholarly study of crania recovered in excavations. It was a science called phrenology that has also been used to differentiate African Americans from white Americans as well. Not surprisingly, Native persons are interested in recovering remains and other cultural objects from the institutions that were endorsing such studies. An article called Frozen in Time by Levitt and Associates points to the underrepresentation of Native Americans in popular media. When a Native American group is underrepresented in the media, or any group for that matter, members of that group are deprived of messages or strategies of how to be a successful person in a society. Their underrepresentation conveys to members of the group that they don't belong and can't be successful in business and education and other areas that are important in society. When Native Americans are shown in the media, they're not usually shown as contemporary people, but instead as 18th and 19th century people. And if they're shown as modern people, they're usually portrayed as poor, uneducated, prone to addiction, and just not being successful in society. Native American identities through the media become homogenized in the larger American culture, have prototypes that are unsuccessful, and associate with stereotypical images portrayed in the media. Finally, Paula Gunn Allen, in an article, Angry Women Are Building, writes about the Native American experience and states that survival is the central issue for Indian women even today. The pre-contact population of Native Americans is thought to have been as much as 45 million people or more, and at one point it has become as low as 270,000. This is a genuine American Holocaust. For several hundred tribal groups, extinction is a reality and not simply a threat in the last 500 years in America. The Indian people's situation is not unlike the genocide we've fought in other parts of the world. The Indian Child Welfare Act was established in 1978 in part to stem the removal of Indian children from their native homes and their placement with white foster families, because there was concern that this removal was also furthering the extinction of tribes and cultures. The author states that every single government, right, left, or centrist in the Western Hemisphere, consciously or subconsciously dedicates itself to the extinction of those tribal people who live within its borders. So these are some things to think about as we continue in our study of Native American and Indigenous persons. If other questions arise as a result of this or other talks, I hope we'll be able to discuss it in class or discussion boards together. Thank you.